So, good afternoon. I want to talk to you about the Warwick People's Inquiry into Climate Change, which is a process that we at Warwick District Council commissioned probably in about, no, it was about August last year, to try and get some input from our local communities, our local residents, into the work that we're doing, and we hope that others will join us in doing around the climate emergency. So, by way of background, Warwick District Council declared a climate emergency in 2019. And in declaring that emergency, it made two commitments. One was to become a net zero carbon organisation by 2025. And the second commitment was to work towards total carbon emissions within the district being as close to net zero as possible by 2030. And it's particularly around that second commitment that there's some major challenges that we need to address, not in conjunction with the communities, in conjunction with businesses, in conjunction with institutions that are based in the district. It's not something that the district council can do on its own. So in adopting that second commitment, we set out a roadmap for a net zero carbon district. And a key part of that roadmap was to set up a people's inquiry or a citizens jury, whatever we want to call it, to make sure that we, in developing detailed plans, really understand more about what local people's concerns are about about climate change, about what the barriers to doing things differently are, and also to really draw on the ideas that local people have. So the People's Inquiry is the name that we've adopted locally. Nationally and commonly, we hear terms such as citizens assembly and citizens jury. Collectively, these things are deliberative processes which enable people to come together to discuss an issue in depth. There are slight differences between things like a citizens assembly and a citizens jury, but broadly they're the same family of processes. So another name for our People's Inquiry could well be a citizens jury, but as I say, we've chosen to call it a People's Inquiry here. Importantly, in setting up our People's Inquiry, we've involved a diverse group of local people. So these aren't people who are experts in climate change. These are people from right across our communities in terms of their backgrounds and their outlooks. And that's, I think, the strength and the beauty of the process that that we've gone through with our People's Inquiry. I've said a little bit about this already, but why did we actually want to commission a People's Inquiry into climate change? And of course, I've already said, you know, we recognise we can't do it on our own. We don't have all of the knowledge and the understanding that we need, let alone the time and the skills. This has to be a community-wide thing. And you know, we also recognise that this sort of process can bring some new ideas and a real fresh perspective. And I think that perspective thing is really important. It's relatively easy for somebody like me working at a local authority to sit down and write an action program with lots of ideas that I think are good ideas. But actually, if those ideas are just my ideas and they don't chime with our local residents, then they're not going to work. We actually need to listen to what people's ideas are and what their motivations are. And we need to listen really carefully, because otherwise we'll be wasting our time and our money. So it's really important that we go through a process like this to use our resources in a way that makes a real difference for local people. So how did our People's Inquiry work? Well, I'll go through the three key parts to it, but I think just in summary, we appointed independent facilitators. Shared Future, they're an organisation that has quite a lot of experience of running these sorts of processes, and have also run processes along these lines specifically about climate change in other places such as Leeds and Lancaster and so on. So they've been a really important part of what we've done. The second part, of course, is the inquiry members themselves. Absolutely central to the whole process, and it's really about supporting them to come up with the recommendations that this is all about, and I'll talk about who the inquiry members are in a moment. And then the third part is something we call an oversight panel, and this is a group of local people from organisations in the district that do have some expertise and some knowledge around either the district or around climate change or around businesses in the area. And the purpose of bringing those people together is to ensure that the process, that the inquiry members are supported in a fair and balanced way to come up with well, a process which brings in those different perspectives that I talked about. So the oversight panel, I'll talk about their role a little bit in a moment, but essentially it's about providing that expert, making sure that the inquiry is supported by that expert advice. Now, one of the things that's really important in these three parts is that none of those three parts are about Warwick District Council. And we were really conscious right from the start that the council itself should be in the background here. So yes, we've commissioned it, but we don't want to be manipulating the outcomes or be seen to be manipulating the outcomes or inadvertently to do things which manipulate the outcomes. So that's why it was really important to have the independent facilitators, really important to have this oversight panel to sit around that core work of the inquiry themselves. So this wasn't about Warwick District Council driving the agenda at all. So the inquiry members, how were they chosen? Well, the facilitator Shared Future did a lot of the arrangements for us, and they appointed an organisation called the Sortition Foundation, who sent out 5,000 letters to local residents in the district. They got back around 500 responses of people saying, yes, we're interested in taking part in this process. And there was a small financial incentive to do that, but essentially it was about people being interested in taking part. And from those 500 responses, 30 people were selected to form the inquiry membership, and they were selected very carefully to reflect the district's population in terms of things like gender, age, ethnicity, disability, geography, and also we looked at indices of deprivation in terms of the locations where people lived as well, so that we got people from some very different socioeconomic backgrounds too. And then the last bullet point is really important. In the 5,000 letters that went out, people were asked to indicate their attitude to climate change, ranging from, yes, I think this is really important, and I'm really committed to doing something about it, through to I'm absolutely not bothered about it, and I'm not particularly interested in climate change, and even people who think it's not a problem. So it was really important that that range of attitudes to climate change was also reflected in the inquiry. The picture here is the chap on is a screenshot from the launch event that the inquiry members did a week or so ago, and the chap who's talking there is a guy called Pete Bryant, who's one of the facilitators on the right, and what he's explaining in that screenshot is about how the 30 people who were selected do reflect the actual makeup of the district. And you can see the pie charts. You won't be able to read them, but you can see those pie charts, the left column being who's actually on the inquiry membership, and the right hand column being the district's population. And you can see it's broadly very similar. So that gave us a lot of confidence that the 30 people selected did actually reflect the district's population in many respects. I won't read this this out in full, but another important thing that was done right at the start of the inquiry process is that we as a council made a commitment to the inquiry members about what we would do with their recommendations. And I've highlighted a bit in the third paragraph there, which says that the council's committed to using these findings to inform its climate emergency action programme for the period 2021 to 2025. The council is expecting to adopt this action plan in 2021 and will include as many of the People's Inquiry recommendations as it can. Where it's not possible or appropriate for the council to adopt any of the recommendations, it will explain why. And we really wanted to make that commitment publicly, and we also wanted to make that commitment very openly to the inquiry members, so they knew that the work they're doing is going to be taken very, very seriously. And obviously now we have the recommendations. I'll talk through later on about how we're actually hopefully fulfilling the commitment that we made back in September to the inquiry. So the question that the inquiry were asked to look at is really quite a simple one. What do we need to do in Warwick District to help address climate change? So as you can see from this question, it's not just about Warwick District Council, although obviously Warwick District Council are important in this. It's about what do we collectively need to do in Warwick District, and that was an important thing. Now that question was a question that was posed by the oversight panel that I mentioned earlier. So the oversight panel played an important role in helping to inform exactly what the inquiry would look at, and also played an important role in deciding who the People's Inquiry were going to hear from in terms of commentators or expert witnesses, and you know that the oversight panel were vital in making sure that there was a good cross-section of people speaking to the inquiry, people who were well informed, people who knew the local area, and people who brought different perspectives to the inquiry's work. Now, what I've done in the next few slides is again take some screenshots from the launch of the recommendations of the People's Inquiry. So these slides were actually slides that were put together by the inquiry members to feedback to in a public event, and also to feedback to the district councillors. And what this slide is showing is a little bit about how the inquiry worked. So the at each of the 10 sessions, and there were 10 2.5 or 3 hour sessions over a period of about 3 months, which included Christmas in the middle of it. At each of those sessions, there were a number of commentators or expert witnesses that came and spoke. And those expert witnesses were given a really strict brief. So they had short timed presentations. They ranged from just a couple of minutes through to about 10 minutes. So get their point across in a really punchy way. There was a real emphasis on not using jargon, and each inquiry member had a red card that they could pick up and wave if people did use jargon. And at that point, the presenter had to stop and explain the jargon that they just used in a way that an ordinary layman would understand. Following the presentations, there were small group discussions where the inquiry members would go away and discuss what they'd heard, and importantly identify questions they wanted to explore more with the commentator. And then they went back and met with the commentator again and had a questions and answers session to make sure they were properly informed about the subject and had understood the subject properly. So the face you can see in the background there is a chap called Dr. Andrew Dyke from Southampton University, and he was talking about climate change science. So as an early stage in the process, informing the informing the inquiry members about how global warming as a science actually works and how carbon emissions contribute to all of that, so that they understood that. So terms of the 10 sessions, the first 3 sessions set out here in this slide. The first session was really an introductory one where the inquiry members were getting to know each other, getting to understand what their brief was and what they were there to do. The second session was a really important one, and I've just talked about, I called him Andrew Dyke, didn't I? Dr. James Dyke. I've also got the university wrong. He was originally from the University of Southampton. He's moved to the University of Exeter, but he was there to do that work on helping them understand climate change. And then the third session was really trying to bring that down to a local level to help the inquiry members understand climate change in Warwick District. And there was a lot here about both the carbon emissions from the district. So Alice Ellis and Matt Rooney talked about talk through a pie chart in effect about where carbon emissions arise from in Warwick District. So, 40% of it being road transport, 25% of it being residential buildings, etc., etc. So they understood the sources of carbon emissions in the district. And then there was some presentations from a local GP and from another lecturer at a university about the impact on things like flooding and health and so on around climate change. So they understand the impacts of climate change locally too. Session 4 then, if they've got a basic knowledge about climate change, session 4 was about, well, what do we actually want to focus on in terms of the topics. And the first topic they focused on was then looked at in session 5, which is around transport. And we got a whole range of different people to talk about different aspects of transport, whether it's good practice from overseas, what's happening locally from Warwickshire County Council, what the issues are for businesses in terms of transport, what the local bus companies are doing and what how they see the future unfolding and so on. Session 6 was about housing, and again, a very similar range of presentations looking at both retrofitting the district's existing housing stock and how do you make that more energy efficient, and how do you reduce the carbon emissions from heating those houses, but also looking at new build as well, and what current developers are doing, what the council's planning service can and cannot do to support zero carbon new housing. Session 8 was about waste, well, actually a combination of things. It was about waste and recycling. So there was a big focus around the waste contract and how we can restrict the amount of waste and how we can limit consuming really, but also what happens when waste is produced and where it goes. But there's also in this session some interesting discussions around how you can finance work around climate change, and also about how all of the different parts actually fit together. So what if you change one bit of a system, what does that do to another bit of a system, and how does that all add up to something that is an integrated program of work? So that was quite a diverse session 8. And then the final 2 sessions were about the inquiry members taking the topics they'd chosen and the information they'd heard to draft up some recommendations. So sessions 9 and 10 were really all about developing the recommendations. So they now have made the recommendations, and I'll share a link as to where you can see the draft recommendations in a moment. But again, in their feedback event from a week or so ago, they talked through the recommendations really in 4 headings. There are in fact about 35 or maybe over 35 recommendations, so I'm not going to go through all of those. And I should also say that those recommendations go into an awful lot of detail in some cases, which is really helpful because that helps us and others who want to look at the recommendations really understand the thinking behind them and the detail behind them. So what you're seeing here in terms of the transport recommendations is just a summary of 4 of the recommendations that relate to transport. And these were the 4 recommendations that they as an inquiry, felt were the most important in relation to transport. So promoting and encouraging people to take up cycling through better infrastructure, making buses more attractive so they become a real alternative to cars, encouraging the take-up of electric vehicles, and importantly, better information through better information about to enable people to plan their journeys. So as I say, there's detail that sits under those 4 recommendations. They equally made a significant number of recommendations about housing, and whilst housing's the generic term they've used, this is actually about housing and buildings in general, not just about housing. But you know, that commitment to make every new house that's built carbon neutral, to refuse planning applications where they're not zero carbon, expecting public buildings and council-owned housing to be retrofitted, and importantly as well, enabling householders throughout the district to retrofit their buildings in a way that where they can rely on unbiased and well-informed guidance about effective ways of doing that. So a team of independent advisors. There was a set of recommendations about communications and education, and another set of recommendations about waste and recycling, which for the sake of the presentation they combined into one grouping. But you know, communications campaign, making sure that there is regular feedback to the inquiry and the wider public on progress, so that there's that sort of sense of momentum, and also so that the council and other organisations can be held to account for the progress they're making as well. Encouraging reuse of items, so you know, things don't end up going to landfill, so they don't become waste. And then also public awareness. No, sorry, not public awareness, but actually encouraging public premises and schools and other things to have zero waste targets. And then the final grouping of recommendations was about finance and a miscellaneous set of other issues. So it's about carbon capture and making sure that we do all we can to actually retain carbon within our soils and our within a biodiverse system as well, through trees and wildflower meadows and highway verges and so on. Investigate the ways to reduce the environmental effects of commuting. So this isn't just about transport. This is about not moving. So you know, home working or using internet cafes to work from, and where commuting does take place, how do we actually minimise the environmental impacts of those journeys? And investigating a range of financing options to pay for climate change measures. So they were recommending back to the council things like community investment bonds, whereby you know, you can release a funding opportunity or an investment opportunity for local people to say, yes, I want to put, you know, £1,000 or £2,000 into this bond, and I know that money is going to be spent by the council on doing good things around climate change, whether it's investing in renewable energy or investing in energy efficiency, energy efficient homes and so on. And then I know that money is going to be paid back to me, albeit at a potentially low rate of interest, but will be paid back to me having been used to do those good things. So those sorts of measures were things that were recommended to us, as well as, of course, things like grant schemes and trying to draw in private sector funding and so on, and you know, the council's own funding of climate change work. And then the final recommendation there about a sustainability committee to oversee the work that we're talking about here. So the recommendations, I'm very happy to share this, so you don't need to write down this web link, but I'm happy to share the presentation. But you can see the full set of draft recommendations. They're on Warwick District Council's website at the moment. The inquiry members are currently still finalising those, so they are subject to change, but I would expect the changes to be only very, very minor. So you can see the recommendations there. In terms of what happens next, Warwick District Council is already thoroughly reviewing the recommendations. We're going through it with our councillors. We're going through it with the heads of each of our service departments, so that they can work out a response to those recommendations, and hopefully that response will generally be, yes, we like this recommendation and we're really happy to take this on board. Where there are technical reasons why they can't, we will be explaining why we can't take on board those. But we also need to review these recommendations with key partners. So clearly, organisations like the County Council, who are responsible for transport, are a key partner in this, and we'll be going through the recommendations and talking those through with them. Likewise, the university too, really important role that the university could have in helping to deliver some of the recommendations, and a whole range of other organisations as well. So we want to do a full response to the recommendations back to the inquiry members by the end of May, and we'll make those responses public. And then we'll feed that into our refresh of the Climate Emergency Action Programme this coming summer. But I think it's important that we understand this isn't the end of engagement with our residents. I think this is very much just the start of the engagement. We need those ongoing processes to keep the dialogue going and to keep on talking about these issues as things change, because we're going to need to be working collectively to achieve that net zero ambition. And as part of that, we will measure and monitor progress towards our ambitions and keep people informed, especially keep the inquiry members informed, so that that dialogue can keep going around it. And finally, there is on the council's website a People's Inquiry webpage, where you can go and have a look at some of the presentations that the inquiry members heard during their process. You can see the launch of the launch event from the recommendations, and you watch the YouTube video there. And as I've already said, you can see the draft recommendations, which we'll be updating very shortly. And as and when the council do respond to the recommendations, we'll be posting that on there as well. That's all from me. I'm really happy to take any questions, although at the moment I just need to find a way of stopping to share. Oh, I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. I've unmuted everybody, so if you want to unmute to ask a question, you can, or you can drop the question into the chat box. So there's been one question: have any patches of land been identified as suitable for rewilding?
We have a small amount of land that has been identified at Newbold Common on the eastern side of Leamington. That was previously a golf course, and the council's been is developing a project to refurbish that area. It'll become a major area for recreation. There's going to be some cycle trails put in that area, but there are some significant parts of that area that are set aside specifically for nature reserves, and as part of that there will be areas that are simply left to naturally rewild, but we will be proactively rewilding some of those areas. In the scheme of things, I fully accept it. It's a small area. It's something that we're interested in talking about more, but the council itself isn't a huge landowner, and we'd need to be working very carefully with the farming and landowning communities across the district to make a big impact on that.
That's excellent. Robert, would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Thank you. Thanks for that talk, Dave. So what funding commitment has the District Council made up to 2025?
The council's budget that was approved a couple of weeks ago includes £500,000 a year specifically for the climate emergency work. I don't know if you're aware, but last year we decided we would hold a referendum in May to ask people if they would pay on average £1 a week more on their council tax, specifically for climate change, addressing climate change locally, which had the referendum been successful would have delivered about £3 million a year for the climate emergency. Because of the pandemic, that referendum wasn't able to take place, and legally we're not allowed to increase council tax to that extent without the referendum. So we've had to identify a smaller sum of money. It's not as much as we would like, but it is what we can realistically achieve within the budgets. But I would add to that, there's a lot of other areas where we're spending money which will have direct impacts on climate change as well. So, for instance, within our separate, we have all of our housing stock is managed through a separate account called the Housing Revenue Account, and we have 5,500 houses. And we've committed £23 million over 10 years to retrofit those houses specifically to address carbon impacts from those properties. So that's a major commitment from within that account. And then there's various other schemes. I've just been talking about the Newbold Common scheme, which will have some real positive impacts around the climate emergency in terms of tree planting and rewilding and those sorts of things, which have their own budgets and their own projects. Similarly, there's a country park being developed to the south of Leamington. About £3.5 million worth of investment in that. Again, some significant climate impacts, but a dedicated budget of about £500,000 a year.
Okay, and we've got one more question. Is there a role for town and parish councils?
Oh, yes. Yeah, definitely. I think there are already a number of town and parish councils within the district who are doing some real great cutting edge work. And I think the real strength of the work that town and parish councils can do is that real local connection with people. So they really know individuals within their communities. They are therefore really well placed to support that networking that can take place. So, for example, in Barford, there's an organisation that's been set up called Bar Zero, and they do things like repair workshops. They are doing various bits of work around tree planting and advice on energy efficiency and so on. Likewise, Kenilworth Town Council have done some work on networking. They have brought together a whole group of organisations to specifically look at climate change. And as a result of that, they've already started doing a sort of programme of events for local people, ranging from things like how do you access the government's Green Homes Grant scheme to, what's the best advice about electric vehicles at the moment, and how do you go about buying an electric vehicle in a way that giving people confidence to do those sorts of things. So those are just two examples, but there are other really good examples as well. And I'd really like to work with town and parish councils to encourage that that bottom-up approach, because this, as I said, is not something that can be done by the council, and it's not something the council should be doing to people. It's something that we all need to be working at together. So, town and parish councils can really support that bottom-up thinking.
That's great, thank you. Robert, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Hello again. So the inquiry findings seem quite strong in their sort of view on planning in terms of new buildings being built that basically are leaky buckets and should be carbon neutral. Now, obviously, the National Planning Law has lots of constraints about what the District Council could refuse. But obviously, the District Council does have control of its own sort of properties and projects. So, do you feel this really means that the District Council has to immediately refocus its own planning plans?
Yeah, I think that two things there. One, for projects that the District Council is getting underway or has started since it declared a climate emergency. I think there is an expectation amongst our councillors that those projects should be zero carbon in operation at least. I mean, there's a much more complicated debate about embodied carbon that we're trying to get our heads around, but that's not an easy one. But in operation, there should be zero carbon. So, for instance, we are bringing forward various sort of council house building schemes in Kenilworth and to the south of Warwick, and those schemes will be zero carbon in operation. So that's where we're building houses ourselves. Likewise, for other kinds of public buildings, we're bringing forward proposals for a community stadium where Leamington Football Club will be based to the south of Warwick. We'd expect that kind of facility to be zero carbon. There are more difficulties around some of the longer running projects that have been around a long time. So there's currently planning applications in for new leisure facilities in Kenilworth. The council isn't committed to those being zero carbon because the work, the sort of architectural work around the design of those buildings started prior to the climate emergency. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a point of debate, but that's where we've got to in terms of the discussions around that. The second thing is around planning, and yeah, you're right. We are limited. It's not possible simply just to refuse planning applications because they're not zero carbon buildings, or at least it's not at the moment. We want to put in place a planning policy to do that, and our planning policy team are working on a development plan which should enable us to do that. But it's not a quick process, and the earliest we'd be able to adopt that kind of policy would be maybe the back end of next year, something like that, because it's got to go through all sorts of consultation and examination processes, and it's a really complicated policy to write as well. So we're working on that. We want to move as quickly as we possibly can so that we don't get those houses being built that aren't zero carbon, because every single one that's built that isn't is going to need to be retrofitted at some point, and you know that's heartbreaking, really.
And Robert.
Yeah, if I can come back. Yeah, sorry, it's a separate question, but you mentioned a county council, and I just wondered what sort of commitment you felt they'd given to the outcome of this inquiry to actually, join with you in action.
So I've spoken to one of their directors about it. I've spoken to their assistant director that's responsible for transport. They are really interested in this and are very much up for sort of sitting down and going through the recommendations in the way that we as a council are as well. So I think really positive noises coming from them. Obviously, transport's going to be a key topic of conversation with them, and they're currently consulting on their local transport plan, and the inquiry recommendations will be submitted as a response to their consultation on the local transport plan, and that's something that I think the county council are happy to sort of welcome and hopefully respond to positively as well.
Thank you so much for speaking on that. I think a lot of people are going to watch back and find it really interesting as well. And it's been really great for having you here and talking today.
No, thank you for inviting me, David, and thanks everyone for listening.